Professor Triggs, I just want to continue a little bit with the examination about your independence, and then if you would be indulge me, I have a particular area of interest, so I want to break into two parts. I arrived here in the Senate in February, so I want to deal with the issue prior to February and post-February, principally because if things have taken a turn for the better, I want to be able to claim having made a contribution. But just on the question of independence, would you agree that independence is by far and away the most important element of your commission? I mean, without independence, you can't function. And I would imagine that for you yourself, as President of the Commission, that this is always foremost in your mind in terms of maintaining the independence of the Commission, and not just in terms of rhetoric, but how the Commission conducts itself, what it does when it chooses to do it, being conscious of the implications or I suppose the imagery projected in relation to the Commission's conduct. So, and thank you for that. That just helped me tidy up to come to understand a bit of where you are and the importance of your independence.
Senator O'Sullivan, can I just add something to what you've said, or I've agreed by nodding, but I'd like to say something if I may.
Sure.
That obviously our independence is important to our work in Australia, how we're perceived to be operating in Australia, and the quality of the evidence-based work that we do in relation to the treaties that are part of our mandate is vital. But there's another element to our independence that's also important, and I think probably unique in Australia, and that is that we are an A-status national human rights body under the United Nations Paris Principles. So our credibility in the international environment depends also on that concept of independence.
Sure.
And in light of that, and with that status, the Australian Human Rights Commission has just been elected to the governing bureau of the global body that regulates or advises national human rights bodies. So when we're looking at what we mean by independence, you might often hear me say we must comply with the Paris Principles. They're absolutely crucial. Every other human rights body in the world, there are 110 of us, do need to comply with those requirements. So it's a profoundly important element of our capacity to operate in the regional and international environment, as well as to operate with credibility in the Australian environment.
Well, so can I just put an example? I hear you, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think we're of one mind. But for example, the Commission would never engage in an act or omission that at the heart of its intent might be to be partisan politically or to influence government policy that the government might be entitled to have, but you might disagree with. That, I mean, those two things would it not compromise the independence?
Oh, not at all. It's very much our role as part of our statute to be in the public arena advocating against something that might be government policy.
No, you've missed the nub of my question, but let's come to it a bit later on. You've missed the nub of my question. So look, just to put the background, my interest is, to put it in perspective, my interest is in policy that works or policy that appears to work, that has an impact, particularly where it affects people's lives, saving lives, and equally as good policy working successfully that has positive impacts for Australia. And lastly, but equally an important consideration for bottom lines of budgets and a whole range of things. So I want to talk to you about the illegal maritime arrivals issue. And in doing so, if we can just go back before my arrival in February, I just want to run some numbers just to get your confirmation. We're not here about fractions. Were you aware that there were only 4 illegal maritime arrival persons held in detention at the end of the Howard government?
Yes, broadly.
And that none of them were children?
Yes, I am aware of that.
And are you aware that between 2008 and 2013, more than 50,000 arrivals occurred after the previous government had a radical change, of course, in policy and abandoning what was then, I think, fondly referred to as the Pacific solution. And in the course of those 50,000 arrivals, you'd no doubt be aware, as the rest of Australia is, that there were 1,200 people who tragically died on the high seas in their efforts to arrive at our shores. And I assume at the heart of the Human Rights Commission is anything that...
Senator O'Sullivan, you should let the witness answer the question.
Sure.
Rather than go on to the next question.
My apologies.
It's just a dick, sir.
But my apologies. Sorry, Professor Triggs.
I am aware that something in the order of 50,000 asylum seekers arrived on our shores, and that approximately 1,200, very sadly, died in the attempt to cross the seas from Indonesia to Christmas Island.
And were you aware that, 8,469 to be precise children arrived with those 51,000 arrivals?
Again, broadly, that's true.
Sure. So, are you aware that at the time that the Labor government left office in September 2013, please let me take my line of questioning, that there were almost 1,400 children, 1,392 children held in detention?
I'm aware of that, yes.
So to crystallise the numbers, if I might, just in my own mind, we've gone from 4 at the last government transition to 1,300, almost 1,400 at the next government transition.
In September last year, when the new government took office, there was something in the region of 1,100 to 1,200 children, is my understanding.
All right. Well, we won't.
No,
we won't split hairs. Your 1,200,
yeah,
my
yeah,
1,400 on average. But the number was very, very high compared to the previous, the transition at the previous transition.
Yes, that is correct.
Would you accept that after the change of government, whether you agree with the parameters or not, all of these parameters have come down significantly in terms of the number of arrivals?
There's no the objective evidence supports what you're saying.
And the number of children in detention?
Now that's a different matter. As you point out, and certainly the figures that I have available to me, when the current government took office, there was something in the region of 1,100 to 1,200 children held in detention. And by February of this year, the number had reduced to something like just under 1,000. So that when I called the inquiry, we were dealing with about 1,000 children in detention. Today, broadly, there are about 740 or 50 children in detention. So the numbers have come down from the time the present government took office by some hundreds, leaving, as I say, about 750 at the moment.
Well, let me just take a point in time. Do you agree that a year after your appointment, there were almost 2,000 children in detention?
That is true. It was, yes, exactly. It was about 1,900 by July of 2013, and I began my job in July 2012. So over those 12 months, the numbers of children in detention continually rose and declined after that period.
So you might help me. I think you've detected where I'm going at the heart of my line. At a point when it peaked a year after, you didn't see fit to commence an inquiry into the issue. You left it until a change of government, and the number had reduced to less than half. And not only on that parameter, on so many other parameters, where the government was clearly working through the log of claims, the people who'd been left over from the 50,000, they're reducing on their way, and you decide to leave it until February of 2014 to commence an inquiry?
Well, there are a number of reasons why I didn't call an inquiry exactly at that moment, as I would very much like to have done, and that was that it was very well known and understood that we would have an election within weeks, and that's exactly what happened. So had I called the inquiry at the peak period, I would have walked straight into a caretaker mode, or certainly into an environment in which this very fraught issue would be highly politicised. And so I made the judgment to leave it until the government had been in power for 4 or 5 months, and when the numbers had not declined appreciably, and as they were being held for unprecedented periods of time, I decided it was time to call the election. Can I also add that...
No, you don't call the election.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, call the inquiry. Then the other answer to your question was that, as you might recall, we had an inquiry by the Human Rights Commission when children were first held in detention. That inquiry was entitled The Last Resort in 2004, and it had been our plan from the day I arrived at the Commission that we would hold a new inquiry to coincide with the 10-year anniversary of the first. The third answer, and perhaps is really just a practical one, is that my predecessor had completed an inquiry literally as I arrived, and we put a lot of resources into that inquiry, and we know that we need huge resources to run any other inquiry, so I felt a little bit of a hiatus might be appropriate. But I quite take your point about the numbers being so high in July, and I've been asked that question very often, and I've had to defend it often. I believe it was the right decision to make. I think it would have been very dangerous politically, particularly in light of the point that you so clearly make, and that is that the whole Commission must act in an unbiased and objective way. And had I done it right in the face of an election, I think that would have been really very inflammatory.
Who was your predecessor?
The Honourable Catherine Branson, a former federal court judge.
And who conducted the inquiry at the beginning of this issue back in 2004? Do you know? Yes,
Dr. Sevo Obslovsky.
So he was the president of the commission?
No, he was the Human Rights Commissioner, not the president.
Okay. Respected?
Very respected, and it was a very important and influential inquiry report.
So are you familiar with his public reference, and I'll quote, and he's referring to your inquiry, and he takes... He says, and I quote, "Certainly the repetition of my inquiry is the highest form of flattery, but the timing is very odd. When the boats were arriving in large numbers and Labor was at its peak of cruelty towards the boat arrivals, the Human Rights Commission almost did not see the problem, and the newly appointed Children's Rights Commissioner was proclaiming that her jurisdiction is limited to domestic matters." So are you familiar with that statement by Mr. Ozdowski?
I am.
And how did you respond to that, Professor Triggs?
I didn't respond to it. Are you asking me to respond now?
Well, you clearly it's within your capacity to do that. I mean, it is a severe criticism and goes to the heart of the inference that I don't make, but I say. Could be taken by people, given the timing of your inquiry at a period, there's a long period there, I think even you'd accept, that this was, in your mind at least, a serious problem. But you don't call an inquiry, notwithstanding what you've had to say, until this problem is being dealt with. It has been worked through very progressively, and the numbers speak for themselves. So I think in the context of the facts and figures as known, and in reference by Mr. Ozdowski, if you wish to respond, be more than welcome. Yes,
I see no reason at all to respond to that comment. He's entitled to make it, but I think the decision was the right one. Can I also point out that your analysis rather assumes that there's been a complete vacuum of work by the Commission in this area? I have to say that for years and years and years, we have been conducting detention centre visits, and prior to my calling the inquiry, I also made detention centre visits, including to Christmas Island and Villawood. So I and the Commission staff have a monitoring role which is assisted by the department. Whenever we ask to go, they will facilitate it, and they have done. In relation to this issue, from the moment I arrived at the Commission, we started again more detention centre visits and reports, and I have reported. We've also dealt with a very high number of complaints, and we've had interventions into High Court matters with their discretion, obviously. We haven't dropped the ball at all.
But if we were to follow what you're saying, when the numbers are up here, the practice of the Commission was to have visits to the detention centres. That was adequate to monitor the situation. As the numbers come away, as the numbers start to fall because of a change of government, because of a change of policy, you decide, do you not, to invoke a higher standard as to how the Commission will engage on this issue. You go to an inquiry. I mean, that would seem to me, and you're welcome to respond, that would seem to me to be in the absolute reverse of what would be a reasonable reaction to the circumstances as presented to the Commission.
Well, firstly, I do dispute that the numbers were coming down. One of the reasons I called the inquiry is that they weren't coming down, and the children were being held for significantly longer periods than had been the case in the past.
You said on your own figures they'd come down to
by 100, 200.
300.
No, they'd come down by a couple of hundred, but it was small.
20%.
Well, that's not a lot relative to the fact that you're dealing with human beings and children. And many of them unaccompanied.
No, but
this is a serious
with respect,
matter.
when there were 8,000 under the Labor government had arrived, and 353 under the coalition government, let's deal with that figure. If you don't want to do the 20% thing, 8,000, no need for an inquiry.
Yeah, but they weren't in detention, Senator. They weren't in detention.
Well, but a large percentage of them found their way through there.
Well,
and then you had
a small number,
a bit over 300 under this government. Those numbers to me seem to clash also.
Well, firstly, that they were not detained, most of those children, some were. But again, for all of last year, I think from the announcement by the Prime Minister in about March that an election would be called, we were living with that reality at any time. And I did not want to walk into a highly politicised, as you will be well aware, this is one of the top political issues for Australia in the last few years, were I, as an incoming president, immediately to call an inquiry on the heels of the previous inquiry in relation to the use of wrist X-rays to determine the age of children. I think there would have been some criticism of that. But I can't make my decisions by reference to other people's criticisms. I have to make my determinations according to what I think is going to be the most sensible use of our resources and the context in which we are making our inquiries. I believe it would have been very destructive to have held that inquiry in July or August last year.
Well, it would have been very destructive to the then government.
I believe it would have been destructive to the Commission, frankly. I was concerned that we would be accused of the very thing that Senator O'Sullivan is saying is so important to us.
Well, Professor, I'm going to stop Senator O'Sullivan there. He can come back later. But before I pass on to Senator Wright, I must say, Professor, you would accept yourself that the fact that the Commission effectively did nothing during the term of a previous government, and when the government changed, you had this major inquiry. You'd understand that some people would say that that places questions on the independence of what has to be a very independent commission.
Well, Senator, I really must challenge the premises of your question, because the Commission, throughout the period of the former government, conducted an inquiry. My predecessor conducted an inquiry that was extremely successful. Well, she reported in the middle of 2012, which is exactly when I came into the office. But Senator Cathy Branson had conducted an inquiry into the mechanisms for determining the age of the children in detention, which is the wrist X-ray mechanism. It was a very successful process. The government had in fact agreed to change their policy before or about the same time as she reported, so it was a very successful exercise, and I very much wanted to take some guidance from the way in which she'd managed this so well. In the sense that she'd maintained good relationships with the department and achieved an outcome that was consistent with human rights. So,
Professor Triggs, my question was not making the accusation, but my question was, you can see why people would say that the independence of the Commission is put at risk when the unprecedented numbers of children are in detention under one government. Under a new government, they start to fall and there's an inquiry held. Now, I'm saying you would appreciate why some would say, well, this Commission is not independent.
I appreciate that people may question why the inquiry was called 4 months or so after the new government came into power. I knew that that was a political risk, and you're quite right in saying that some people have perceived it in that way. I've tried to explain it as I called it and the reasons I called it. I think that the work of the Commission, the quality of the work that we do, historically and I believe now, commands greater respect than the allegation that we acted politically. We did not, and I did not, and I will stand by the decision that I made to hold it when I did.
Right.